All right, well, let's talk about your top story, which is what's going on in Ukraine and this fast-tracking NATO membership, plus some craziness in Mexico.
Right. So you may think, if you live in North America, that, oh, you know, these weapons, that's all happening over there. I'm all good and safe. Well, why now are Javelin missiles that the U.S. sent to Ukraine showing up in the hands of Mexican gangs?
That's a good question.
North America.
That's a good question.
That is what the news in Mexico is reporting. I'm going to let you see just the top of this. And since I assume you don't speak Spanish, I'll speak over her. So go ahead and watch what this newscaster in Mexico says.
Presunto miembro del Cártel del Golfo en Tamaulipas fue grabado portando una de las armas más exclusivas y poderosas, un javelin, que en teoría se vende únicamente al ejército y ha sido...
So what she's saying here is that the cartel has a javelin, at least one, the most exclusive and powerful weapon that you can find. She says that this cartel member here, see, they freeze it and they show you, yeah, this came from Ukraine, that it is now in the eastern state of Tamaulipas. And that weapon that can be found on the black market right now is worth between $20 and $60 million. She also reports that dozens of U.S. AT-4 weapons that were made in Sweden, originally given away to Zelensky in Ukraine, have indeed shown up in Mexico. This is in the border town of Matamoros. Take a look here on the map and see just how close that is to the U.S. border. We were warned that the weapons that the West is sending to Ukraine were ending up in the black market. Now they are in the hands of the cartel right on the southern border. So do you still feel good about those weapons aid packages going all the way over there?
But like, think about that. There's no way they got that from overseas and then sent it back, right? So it's like, are they just like, they would have probably got that before it was even shipped out. How is that possible?
Wait, what? How do you mean? Why can't they get it there from there to here?
It's still on this continent, meaning it didn't leave this continent and then come back. Like, how did they get it in just on the other side of Mexico? Meaning that there's some like if these are getting shipped overseas, you would think that they follow them to the shipping yard, they follow them to where they go, and then they go overseas. It's all tracked somehow, at least to get over there. But they're having it right across the border.
No, we know that they're not.
That doesn't make any sense.
We know that they're not being tracked. We've known that for a long time. We've been saying that since at least last summer. We've been saying that.
My point is, I just think that they would be tracked at least out of the U.S.
Well, some of them never were in the U.S. because a lot of times these weapons, for instance, the tanks, the United States either leases them or has some sort of intellectual property ownership of them. So the United States has given permission, for instance, the F-16, was it the F-16 fighter jets? Mm-hmm. One of the F-level fighter jets. Biden recently said that he was giving permission to NATO countries to send them. So the United States sort of ordains it, and then other countries send them. And we talked about recently how Spain and Portugal were like, we're not going to send those. We need them. So these weapons that she's talking about were made in Sweden and then gifted to Zelensky. But we've talked many times about how they are not tracked. And so they end up on the black market. I would think that the cartel has an easy way to ship them because they a lot of times import their drugs in at seaports. I don't think it would be that much harder to get guns in. I mean, if you were to ask me how it's done, like if I wanted to smuggle these arms in, I'm the wrong person. I don't know how to do that. Do you know how to do that? But I am pretty sure that there are people who could do that fairly easily if you are a member of the cartel.
So people are questioning whether or not this is in fact a javelin, and there's differing opinions of exactly what model number this is. By the TV station, specifically the Mexican TV station, identified it as a Raytheon-made FGM-148. It is believed to be a Javelin missile launcher. And so I don't know where the distinction is, but we know that, of course, a lot of these have already been flooding into parts of Africa. They've been flooding into parts of the Middle East. Most of this stuff is winding up. We've shown you websites. We've shown you almost like eBay style black market websites where this stuff is being sold on the black market. Russia has gotten their hands on it. They've been able to buy the stuff on the black market and show that we have American weapons that are right here. Mm-hmm. The Wall Street Journal has admitted that most of these weapons they can't track and follow. So it's not a surprise at all. And some in the chat are even saying, wouldn't be surprised if we actually sent them directly to the cartel, which... That is something I hadn't thought of before.
But think about it. That kind of goes along with the narrative they've been talking. They've been floating it around. Lindsey Graham talked about it, invading Mexico. And if we can say, hey, they're stealing our weapons, now we have no choice but to invade.
Right.
Yeah,
but it's not surprising, if you have been following the narrative, that Ukraine doesn't know what they're doing with this stuff. In fact, even today, the Wall Street Journal published this crazy video showing that, look at the headline, Ukraine might struggle to maintain these Abrams tanks. They kind of compare this to like, well, you know how to drive, but you may not know how to drive like the latest model of something. You know, you'll eventually figure it out. I found this bit especially interesting from this editor at the Wall Street Journal. Listen in if your ears perk up at the same place mine did.
2014. So they are not going to be starting from scratch learning how to drive a tank here. They will have to learn how to use the Abrams tanks. They'll have to learn how to use the targeting system. The Abrams is a 4-person tank. The Soviet tanks have 3 people in them. So they'll have to learn details. But if you know how to drive a tank, you know how to drive a tank. So one way to think about this would be you go from a 10-year-old Toyota to a new Tesla. You know how to drive, you just have to learn how to do it on this new vehicle.
Okay. A tank's a tank, he says. We didn't have the sound on for the first part. What he says is they've been fighting the Russians since 2014. That's interesting, because the Western media has pretended like this war broke out in March of 2022. So is this the first Western media's admission that Ukraine has been bombing ethnic Russians inside their own country since 2014? Kind of a backwards way to say it, but okay. They present points about how the trucks that bring support to these tanks can't get through all the terrain. Like if it's muddy, the tank can get through, but the truck that brings the parts that support it can't. Like, is this a new problem? Doesn't everyone in war have this problem? You know, and they're presenting it as like a folly of Ukrainian military might. Like they have these unique problems. Like, sorry, but I'm pretty sure that everyone in war has that problem. Like if a tank breaks down, you need some kind of support to get to it. And it's hard for that support to get there, right? This to me doesn't seem new. Like even, I know I talk about the Mongols a lot because I read a book about the Mongols. The Mongols had ways to do this. Like they had a lot, like this, I don't know. There's a lot of sort of excuses being offered to the Ukrainian military. A lot of passes. And again, if your military is full of first timers, as many Ukrainians admit, they're not trained for this. They don't want to go and die on the front lines when this is their first military experience. And then people get hurt because they don't know what they're doing. That's what happens today. Take a look at this article from NBC News reporting that Russians killed civilians in Ukraine. See, it says here, Russian bombardment of Ukraine capital kills at least 3 people, including a child. But then take a look at this explanation. It says Ukrainian air defenses shot down all 10 cruise and ballistic missiles launched by the Kremlin, but falling debris caused damage and casualties, wounding 6 people and killing those 3, according to authorities. So if all 10 missiles were shot down, Russia did not hit its target, and there is no assurance that they were targeting civilians then. It was Ukraine that shot them down into civilian areas, which we have seen them do many times before, like last week in Dnipro. And this is what happens when you send weapons into the hands of untrained forces. People get hurt and die. Now, meanwhile, Russia says that it has destroyed Ukraine's last warship. This is a Russian military leader who is saying this, and I just muted it because I assume you don't speak Russian. What he's saying is that they destroyed Ukraine's last warship, the Yuriy Olefirenko, in the port of Odesa. They also claim to have pushed Ukrainian units out of 2 settlements in the Donetsk region. I'm not going to try and say the names of them. They're written there. And fighting continues in an area between those 2 settlements called Avdiivka. He also mentions they're using these kind of, flamethrower fighting. So it's really heated up there. These regions, again, I should remind you, voted to join Russia last fall, but Ukraine has continued to attack in order to keep them. And Ukraine launched more attacks inside of Russia, this time in the border town of Shebekino. And at least 2 people were hurt in the shelling that was reported to last for over an hour. Now, again, this follows a week of attacks on Russian civilians in Russian borders. And Russian President Putin has says he will retaliate, but he hasn't said exactly how. The U.S. sort of maintains that, yeah, we generally don't support attacking inside of Russia. We know it's happening. We're not for it. You know, it's kind of like the sports team across the bay. You know, we don't have much opinion about it. UK politicians say Kiev should attack wherever it pleases. And a German spokesperson this week said that the attacks in Moscow are legitimate, as in, go ahead, fair game. And now to NATO, Zelensky is playing this game of, it's kind of, I'm going to say it in a crude way, like crap or get off the pot. You know that expression?
Yeah. And the way my dad used to say it. Yeah, it's, we want fast track into NATO. And I think this is a smart play here on their part. I mean, because if the West is sort of hemming and hawing about sending weapons, he's putting them literally on notice right now to give us a fast track into NATO or be done with us.
Right. So what he's saying is that, this is according to the Financial Times, he's pressuring NATO to join, Ukraine to have full membership, none of this dating anymore. Like, it's time to put a ring on it. And he says, if not, I'm not coming to your party in July. This NATO meeting that we have planned next month, I'm not going to come. If I'm just if I'm just your girlfriend, we want to be married, right? Here's what he said. Ukraine is ready to be in NATO. We are ready for when NATO is ready. We need all the unity through the alliance, and we are working on it. He says he needs a clear invitation to Ukraine is needed. Doubts must vanish. Positive decisions for Ukraine will be positive for everybody. There should be no hot war or frozen conflict on our continent. When there are no security guarantees, there are only war guarantees. So he's basically saying, look, we're in this war because we're not a full-blown part of NATO. You're not protecting us. This is, again, it comes off like a girl trying to get her boyfriend to just commit already. Like, I'm done with this. And NATO has continuously said they don't want this because of corruption in Ukraine, which continues to be a problem. But now that there's this ultimatum, they do seem to be having their hands forced because they don't want him to go and negotiate peace. I
don't think that they're really against them joining NATO at all. I mean, Jens Stoltenberg has said openly that they're for it, and they reaffirmed that a few weeks ago. I think the EU is pointing out the corruption, and we're not really moving towards EU membership just yet. We'll hold off on that. NATO seems much more willing to want to poke the bear. But
they've sort of paid lip service to this all along, and we'll see.
Yeah.
But again, all member states have to vote for it, and there have been plenty of member states that are not in favor of this. So it could really fracture NATO as we know it.
Yeah, and as Colonel Douglas McGregor has said on our show, he really believes that this is the end of NATO, that this is going to be the death of NATO. And this idea that it's a defensive organization is laughable, absolutely laughable at this point. When you extend NATO right up to the door of the Russian bear, you're not a defensive organization at all. That's not
no.
Go take it. You haven't been since the 1950s when you were founded.
In fact, last week I saw that NATO posted a tweet about gay pride and that kind of thing, and saying we intend to. How did they put it? It was like, we stand for all identities and genders or something, and we will act to defend these things. To which I wondered, are we going to start bombing for ideology then? Because diversity bombs, that's fine, right? So this is what they're doing now. They're standing for ideological ways that
equity
the whole
bombs.
World has to be. It's pretty interesting. Although I would say, if you call Zelensky's bluff, he's still going to show up in Western countries. He's still going to come to your party.
Yeah. Do you think he's going to, if President Biden invites him to Washington, he's not going to show up now? He's just going to
He's not going to come to NATO countries. He's no longer going to ask NATO countries for money. No, of course he's still going to be showing up.
But I think this is a ploy.
If he were alone in Kiev with no Western media interested in him.
This is a ploy. This is a smart move.
Right, so what I'm saying is call the bluff.
It's good cop, bad cop is what they're trying to do here.
Yes.
Right? And I think it's probably, he doesn't move unless the puppet masters in Washington make him move, or the intelligence community in the intelligence staff in London make him move, right? So they're telling him what to say in this regard. They're telling him, hey, draw a line in the sand right now. Push NATO in this direction. and it'll force their hand, and then NATO will feel like they're compelled. We had no choice. We have to come to his defense. We have to fast track membership into NATO, which would be World War III if we're not already there. We absolutely are, but this would solidify that.
Yes, and then every NATO country has to now put their entire firepower behind Ukraine, which they have been loath to do, or at least slow to do. Now, meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron has proposed a peace summit, but he won't invite Russia. The peace plan, which was published a few months ago, involves Russia relinquishing the area it has already annexed, including Crimea. Once again, I think it's worth noting that these people asked Russia to intervene on their behalf because they were tired of being attacked by Ukraine and since 2014, and then voted last autumn to join Russia. It is not for us in the West to tell them they need to then go back to Ukrainian borders. But that's what Emmanuel Macron feels very comfortable doing. And I think it's worth. Oh, yeah, Philip, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just, so they're going to have a peace summit and they're not going to invite one half of the problem. Like, how does that work?
Yeah.
How can that's not a negotiation. I can't negotiate with you if I don't say anything. I can't just sit in my office and be like, no, remember I negotiated that, and this is now the pay raise I'm getting. I know I didn't tell you, but that's okay. Like, how the hell do you do that?
It's theater. It's absolutely theater. But I think it's always worth looking at the map to figure out what is at stake here and just remind ourselves. This map here is the current war trajectory map from Financial Times. It still shows Crimea as contested, even though, it's not really. And the areas that it shows in black, this outline here, those are the areas that voted to be a part of Russia, but Russia does not have military control of those regions yet. I don't feel like that's a very good representation. So I went to the Russian news outlet, RIA. So that is a little bit clearer, even though it's not in English. So again, this dark gray area. So the red is where Russia has military control. Crimea is just in this map, part of Russia, uncontested, right? But the red is where they have gained since March of 2022. The gray is where they continue to push forward because they believe that those regions are ethnic Russians and voted to be a part of Russia. They consider it part of Russia. They just don't have military control right now. So in theory, the war would end when Russia hits those gray parts, when those gray parts turn red, which by all measure, it is moving towards doing. And maybe we're wrong. Maybe they'll keep going towards Poland. No one knows for sure, right? But the West is saying no peace talks until all of that red reverts to Ukraine. Russia is absolutely not going to do that. Again, because they believe those people voted. I believe, too, that those people voted to become a part of Russia. And it is not for the West to force them back into Ukraine. They didn't even want to be a part of Ukraine when Ukraine was rebuilt in 2014. And so if anyone was serious about peace, wouldn't they propose that the territory split according to the votes and people stop dying right now? Those are the new border lines, and it ends. I know that's an overly simplistic way, but when you look at the map and you realize people are dying, Russians are pushing forward to that line where they say they will stop. Why don't we give them a chance, right? I mean, everybody would win. Ukraine would win because it keeps the territories that want to stay Ukrainian and people stop dying right now. Russia would win because those people that voted for membership are now protected. Bonus is they get access to those important mineral mines that are there that Kiev had been exploiting before. And the West wins because they stopped destroying their economy for a bloody and pointless war. So why is no Western leader seriously proposing this?
Because they don't want it. They absolutely want the destruction of Russia, and they are an absolute threat to the West. With the rise of Russia and the strength of the Russian and BRICS coalition, and the strength of the the Chinese-Russian coalition, this is an absolute threat to the U.S. dollar, and it's about U.S. dollar hegemony and Western hegemony. That's what it is. So they will not allow this to happen. They've called openly for the removal of Vladimir Putin and the destabilization of Russia. That's absolutely what they want. And they've gotten the opposite, as we talked about last night with Scott Ritter here on the show. The opposite has happened. Russia is now stronger than it's ever been as a result of this. So it's not going to happen.
It's because, neocons lose then if it,
right.
But I just have to wonder when someone, is interacting with you and they have a Ukrainian flag in their profile, I just have to wonder, do you want these areas that voted to be Russian and asked Russia to intervene on their behalf, do you want to force them back into Ukraine? Is that what your Ukrainian flag means? I'm just very curious.
Yeah. Or do you care about the Ukrainian people who are being thrown into the meat grinder, the 16-year-olds, the 15-year-olds that are being thrown into war, the 65-year-olds that are being thrown into the meat grinder now.
The men who have no military training and couldn't leave with their families.
Yeah,
and
because then
go to the front line.
To that, I would raise a Ukrainian flag and say, absolutely. We don't want those people to die. We don't want any of these people to die. So what does that mean then when you put up a Ukrainian flag profile? Like, you have some Ukrainian heritage, I get that. But if you have no connection whatsoever and you just want to virtue signal, what are you signaling?
Right. Because to me, there's...
it makes it...
Yeah, go ahead.
It just makes it really easy for them to keep throwing money because they have this poor Ukraine that needs our money, they need our help, but they know that people aren't going to vote for boots on the ground. If they try to put boots on the ground, people are like, no, we're not for that, but we're okay sending money. And it's like they're going to do all that. Then they're going to move to Taiwan and do the same thing. So to me, it all just looks like a big money play. They're like, let's just dump as much money as we can as possible to get our war contractors happy, all these elites happy. Then we'll go to Taiwan and do it. And then we can still send money because people are going to be like, oh, we don't want to put boots on the ground, but we still got to support them. And we still got to support Taiwan and all that. So it just seems like money to me.
Oh, it is. It's the military-industrial complex. It's the neoconservatives. It's the neocons. And it's the Democrats, too, who make boatloads of money off of these guys. I mean, who funnel and, throw millions of dollars at their campaigns and put them in Washington so they can curry favor.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people agree that's not a javelin. People keep continuing to say it's not a javelin. There seems to be back and forth on whether or not it's an AT-4. The Swedish-made rocket, which is like the disposable, unguided rocket that we saw at the beginning of the report.
Maybe there's, what
people are saying, it could have just been an empty shell. It could have been an empty launcher. And to the point that...
I thought javelins came out of trucks. Like, I thought those were the ones that are on the back of the big trucks.
No, those are shoulder fire.
It could also be lost in translation. She says javelin.
Javelin.
And
she says
maybe
javelin.
that means something else in Spanish.
But that's what she said. So we're just saying what she said, and that's what that Mexican news station was reporting. But to our eagle-eyed observers and others, yes, it does look like an AT-4, the Swedish-made, unguided. It's not
actually,
as...
she later does say AT-4s. What she's pointing out here, maybe that's not.
So maybe in other video they've captured, there's javelins and AT-4s. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter. AT-4s... comes from, they coming from the Ukrainian army surplus store, basically. It's it's like the overflow of Ukrainian arms. It doesn't matter if it's an AT-4. It doesn't matter if it's a javelin. It doesn't matter if it's coming out of there. It's flowing right into the hands of these individuals.
They have military grade weapons, period. Full stop.
Right. Yeah. And where are they getting them? Because we know where they're getting them. That's the bottom line, and how these things are flowing all over the world. I mean, I've talked to sources. I've talked to excellent sources who've told me that these weapons are flowing into Africa, African nations, flowing to Latin America, and they're coming right out of Ukraine. And that is a fact. So we can parse words over.
I'm trying to remember. We reported on it a while back, but wasn't there like a cargo jet that came from Ukraine to Greece that was just full of weapons? Didn't we report something like that, or did I dream that?
Oh, yes.
I thought so.
Yeah, oh, yes. And that was a big story that actually got swept under the rug. We covered it here on the show. And that was actually a big story. Why was a cargo plane filled with weapons suddenly downed over Greece? And it totally was ignored. And it was filled with weapons. That was a pretty big story, and we covered it here on the show, I think last year, last spring perhaps, or last summer, I think. But it got no coverage in the mainstream media, absolutely at all. And that was a big story.
All right. Well, thank you for your eagle-eyed weaponry expertise. I appreciate that. Let us
Thanks to all of our javelin users. They're like, I've got javelins in the garage. Right. That is not a javelin.
Okay.
I was just out shooting a buck. I took down a bull earlier today.
So I do speak Spanish, and I just kept listening to her over and over again to make sure I had it right. And it is highly possible that the word she's using for this weapon is just something that I hadn't heard before. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, yeah.
We could take it as user error. I'll take that one. And take it for what it's worth.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.